Hello, everyone. Hello again for those of you who stuck around. So I just wanted to quickly welcome you all to the Network Mobility Lab, the spring series, a lecture series. So this is actually our fourth year doing this. We began a lecture series in 2019 where we are highlighting scholars in the fields of mobilities and mobile communication and getting them to speak on something that's interesting or provocative or relevant to our current state of being in this world. So just a bit about the Network Mobilities Lab. So this lab was formed in 2006 under the previous title of the Mobile Gaming Research Lab. A couple of years ago, we decided to rebrand to encompass the kinds of activities that we were doing as scholars and graduate students in the research lab. So these kinds of works include a lot of open access projects that think critically about mobile communication or network mobility. So for example, we have a retro mobile gaming database that is a collection of mobile games from 1975 to 2008 and sort of archives that history of mobile games. We also have the Mobile Network Creativity Repository, which talks about creative ways in which people make interventions into their daily mobilities and networked connections to try to achieve access or to move through the world in ways that otherwise might not be possible if they didn't make those interventions. And so those are just a couple. We also have an upcoming podcast where Adriana and I will be interviewing key scholars in the field. So we have a lot of activities going on. So I just wanted to briefly introduce the Network Mobilities Lab specifically for existing graduate students and the prospective students who are in attendance today. And also just thank you for being here. So I'm going to now hand it over to Adriana, who's going to introduce our guest speaker.
All right, thank you, Reagan. And what Reagan didn't mention is that she is the co-director of the lab with me. So I just wanted to say a few words to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Eric Gordon. Eric is a professor of media art at Emerson College, the director of the Engagement Lab, and assistant dean of civic partnerships in the School of the Arts. He's also an instructor of architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and a research affiliate with the Department of Comparative Media Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His current research focuses on smart governance, specifically how new technology and media impact the way people trust institutions. He specializes in collaborative research and design processes and has served as an expert advisor for local and national governments, as well as NGOs around the world, designing responsive processes that help organizations transform to meet their stated values. He has created over a dozen digital games and apps for public sector use and advised organizations on how to build their own inclusive and meaningful tools. He's the author of over 24 academic articles on public engagement and technology, and the author of 2 books about media and cities, The Urban Spectator and Net Locality, that we co-authored together. And is the co-editor of Civic Media, Technology, Design, Practice, and Ludics, Play as Humanistic Inquiry. His book, Meaningful Inefficiencies, Civic Design in an Age of Digital Expediency, examines practices in government, journalism, and NGOs that reimagine city innovation beyond efficiency. So with that, welcome, Eric.
Can you hear me? Is this on? Good enough? All right, great. Hi, everyone, and hi, everyone again who I got to meet a little bit this morning. It's really great to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Adriana, and for everyone's hospitality. So today, my talk, as you see here, Trust by Proxy, how AI, Web3, and influencers are shaping smart governance and what to do about it. So I feel like we got at some of these questions earlier this morning, so I hope to not be too repetitive. But let me just dive in. So, as has already been mentioned, I've been studying and creating novel public engagement strategies now for over a decade. At the Engagement Lab, we focus on collaborative design and creation of transformative media and technology. So, for example, we have a citywide initiative in Boston in collaboration with the Mass General Hospital Center for Gun Violence Prevention and a half a dozen community partners focused on addressing urban gun violence with the arts and technology. For over a decade, I have co-created games and playful systems with governments and community groups that create what I call meaningful inefficiencies in civic life. And so as I'm telling you this because it's a context for what I want to talk about today, and as I already mentioned earlier, that I've invested my time in creating engaging front ends for participation through games and mobile apps. And that is important work, and it still needs to be done. But the reality is that too often, no matter how creatively an institution captures data, there is very low capacity for them to make sense of it. So in this sense, I have become interested in the back end, in institutional listening, and in what it takes for engagement to mean anything. So I'll begin with a quote from Suzanne Scott, who's the chief executive of Fox News Media, a news outlet that is currently struggling with audience trust. While we might just blame the plight of Fox News on blatant lies and a high-profile lawsuit, I think there are other things going on. So this is from Suzanne Scott. She says, "But I think we're living in a new world in a sense, where half of the voting population doesn't believe in big corporations, big tech, big media. There's a lack of trust. And when they feel like things are being done behind closed doors in rooms that they can't understand, it exacerbates the emotion and how they feel about the process." So it's hard for me to admit that, but the CEO of Fox News Media is onto something. That there is this lack of trust in news organizations and in other organizations is endemic. So Ms. Scott's quote actually captures something quite profound. Indeed, there is a lack of trust, one that represents far more than just lack of daylight. This lack of trust is a generalized trust deficit in all institutions, except businesses, interestingly, the most trusted institution worldwide. As represented here in the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer, government and the media suffer from a significant lack of trust. So Edelman does this barometer every year. This is their 23rd. This is from the 2022 Trust Barometer. It shows that trust fell slightly worldwide, but this is trust in government, but this fall was much more pronounced in democratic countries. So for example, trust in government in the Netherlands fell by 11 points and by 12 points in Germany. So while more local governments tend to be more trusted than the national governments, many of them struggle to gain or regain legitimacy. So this is the context that I want to start today. I'm going to define a few terms to get us started. And I'll start with governance. It's a term of art used to describe how decisions get made by institutions aided by technology. Smart governance in particular. So Meyer and Bolivar argue that the smartness of a city refers to its ability to attract human capital and to mobilize this human capital in collaboration between the various organized and individual actors through the use of information and communication technologies. So they actually identify four typical conceptualizations of smart city governance. One, government of a smart city, so like the actual structure. Two, what they call smart decision making. Three, smart administration. And four, smart urban collaboration. So smart urban collaboration refers to the notion that what makes a city smart is the ability for local governments to partner with other sectors, especially community groups, both formal nonprofits and informal mutual aid, to achieve mutually beneficial ends. So this form of smartness is the application of desires for smart physical infrastructure, where environments are responsive to individual patterns, to smart social infrastructure, where institutions are responsive to individual patterns. So this is not just a matter of logistic superiority, where digital media aids in smart decisions based on the collection, analysis, and sharing of data. It requires the cultivation of trust in non-human systems to address or repair trust in human systems. So I want to dig into trust. Trust is the way we form expectations about the future. And we can define it in two ways. This is how it's been defined in the literature. The first one is trust through faith. This is when we have to make a decision between two alternatives, and we trust the actor that involves less risk. So this is generally a hunch. We know we trust our friends or families beyond any rational process. So there's some element of faith We know that there's a possibility of failure anytime we trust anything or entity. On the other hand, we have trust through confidence. So confidence does not involve making decisions. It's our basic expectation of how things will develop. For example, we have confidence that the bus will arrive, but there's no necessary faith involved in that. We just build confidence of a transaction over time. De Filippi et al. Expand on this distinction in a really important way. And De Filippi is one of the most prominent scholars in blockchain and trust. And this is an article of hers that looks specifically, it's about blockchain, but we're not going to go there yet. But this is what she says. She says, trust in an institution takes the form of a sustained belief that the institution will act and operate in line with the interests of the trustor, even though the trustor does not know or fully comprehend the internal workings of the institution. So every time, I mean not every time, but often when we trust in government to make good on any kind of policy promise, for example, where there's some leap of faith involved in that institutional trust relationship. Confidence, in contrast, does not presuppose an acknowledgement of risk, but rather an attitude of assurance. So as opposed to trust, confidence does not require an individual to put herself into a vulnerable position because it does not operate under a condition of uncertainty. So we can talk about this distinction, and I will a little bit, but I think that for now, if we could just kind of see this distinction that De Filippi and others are establishing, that the relationship between the trustor and the trustee is different when we're talking about faith or confidence, and the way that institutions build confidence is different than the way that they rely on faith. So public institutions, as I've already mentioned, are experiencing considerable mistrust. So we know that that's the case. With the rise of fascism and isolation around the world, we have seen an amplified fear of institutional corruption, for example, election denying in the United States, coupled with a deep suspicion of other cultures and people. And in a context of networked communication, public institutions are struggling to respond effectively. So they are seen as too slow, too general to meet specific needs, and consequently, inauthentic representations of the public. So this harkens back to what Emma was talking about earlier. So I recently published a report with the Knight Foundation that seeks to answer the question, how are cities using technology to solve for trust? And so I want to dig in a little bit into that, some of the findings from the report, and I'll expand a bit more from there. So the methods that I use with my co-author, Tomas Guerna, it's interview-based research. We had 30 semi-structured interviews with city innovators in the US, Spain, and Argentina. And then we also included a discourse analysis of various novel interventions and procedures. So in our research, we learned that most city leaders acknowledge they have a trust problem. So that may not be surprising to you. But they tend to diagnose it in two distinct ways. So for some leaders, the lack of trust stems from the perception that the government does not share values with constituents. So this means the government cannot connect with its citizens meaningfully, and therefore has trouble providing public services. So, and for others, lack of trust is due to the perception that the government is incapable of facilitating reliable transactions. So this means that the government is seen as too inefficient or too slow compared to the efficiency and speed that the media ecosystem has gotten people used to. So there's a number of factors there that go into this perception of lack of confidence in transactions. That what we heard from a lot of government practitioners is that, well, people are used to getting information and things right away. And so government can't do that, right? So the perception of unreliability of the government organization was connected to people's media habits. And misalignment of values, of course, is connected to that as well, but those who talked about misalignment of values was really, we can't do anything because people see us as not representing them. And mostly, in this case, in the United States, not surprisingly, people were referring to communities of color in the United States as being disengaged from government institutions. And so that's how they understood the problem of values, was mostly along race and ethnic lines. So when a group of engineers, this is just an example of misalignment of values. So when a group of engineers partner with the Boston Public Schools to change the start times of schools, families protested because they felt that the process did not reflect their circumstances. And this is an image that I use in my book, Meaningful Inefficiencies. I just love because it represents a protest right after the school start times were announced, where families were essentially articulating that there was no process here, our values aren't being considered, and the entire sort of resistance was based on this notion that technology was being placed over families, and then ultimately the school system had to retract what they were doing, and the school start times were never changed. So on the other hand, this lack of confidence might be represented by dashboards. So this public dashboard in London represents the city's attempt to build confidence in transactions, even if they can't align values. So what is happening across cities, and this is across the world really, is the emphasis on building dashboards as a way of representing the reliability of transactions, right? So not only for the purpose of leadership, and I mentioned before that mayors love having dashboards in their offices, but beyond that, a lot of these dashboards are public, and what they're supposed to communicate is that things are getting done, right? Transactions are happening, and confidence should be built in the public institution. So government programs designed to address the trust deficit, however it is diagnosed, exist within a spectrum between two approaches. On one end, cities are investigating and bolstering the trustworthiness of the institution itself. This is done through communicating the benevolence and capability of the government by investing in programs where people have positive experiences with government agencies or government actors. And we talked about this a little bit also before. This is where co-design, this is where collaborative processes of all sort come into play. When governments are investing in those community processes, essentially what they're saying is that the community trust is faltering because values aren't aligned, and if we do collaborative processes, we can align those values. So that's what's happening ultimately, but the investment in that institutional trustworthiness is significant, as we also talked about. So on the other end of the spectrum, cities are investing in proxy relationships, where a human or machine actor function as an intermediary between the institution and the constituent. So when repairing links of trust with particular constituents is perceived to be too costly, institutions are incorporating intermediaries that help to facilitate the relation between the institution and the constituent. And so, and not to be too simplistic here, but certainly often the decisions about how these institutions act is based on, what kind of resources are in place, what kind of time is possible, right? So when governments are making decisions to sort of do participatory processes because they want to build that institutional relationship and create that, and create the institutional trustworthiness, that's a particular long-term investment often in those outcomes of trust versus the kind of proxy relationship that we saw a lot of during COVID, where proxies are being developed to kind of stand in for the institution. Let me explain a bit more about that. I'll start with institutional trustworthiness. And as I mentioned, this is the process of institutions communicating their benevolence and capability to those that they serve or represent. So I'm going to give you a few examples. This is a project that I did in Boston. In 2020, I was part of a group that created the People's Collaborative Governance Network. And this was a group of stakeholders across sectors who sought to create programs and policies for greater trust in local service provision. So in 2020, we were specifically responding to the COVID context. And what we did was we mobilized this multi-sectoral group of stakeholders, including people from government, from NGOs, from universities, community organizations, and just active community members, to be a part of this network. And what this network did was try to facilitate novel procedures that enabled a kind of governance that was collaborative in a context of COVID. Now, again, what was happening during COVID was that all participation processes moved online, right? So governments didn't know how to connect with constituents because they couldn't. I should say this happened in the Northeast. This was a highly analog process. The making of the collaborative governance network, a social, and we were focusing on building a social architecture designed to build trusted structures for decision making. So I just want to highlight a couple of the projects that came out of it. This was a project that was led by community members called Getting Connected, and this is a very simple project, which is a step-by-step, very visual guide to getting on Zoom and other other video services. And because what we heard from community members was like the older people in my community can't participate even though they want to, and so we needed to find ways of creating capacity for people to use their phones to get on Zoom or WebEx so that they can participate. So this guide was created. It still exists. This has now been translated into 3 languages. It's in Spanish and in Haitian Creole, which is the one of the more popular languages in Boston. And so the 3 languages, it's been distributed all throughout the city, and it was a remarkable intervention in a short term that was focused on the kind of infrastructure of governance, right? In order for people to participate, they need to have access. In order to have access, we need to build these structures to do this. And then another project really quickly, this was a toolkit that we created around the same time for government organizations and community groups to use. It was called Just Engagement. The guide was adopted by the development agency in Boston to support its community process at a time when everyone was struggling to interact with constituents. So this is a project that was embraced by the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and because they actually came to this new network, this People's Collaborative Governance Network, and said, help us figure out how to connect with people, right? So we created this thing. Incredibly analog process, where in this case, institutions were invested in the institutional trustworthiness of the institution. So this happens in different ways as well. So in the city of Philadelphia, the approach was much more incremental and incorporated a range of tech and human procedures. So the smart city director from the city of Philadelphia told us the following: what we expect to create here eventually is stronger alignment between community expectations and government decision-making, and government messaging and government work. So in essence, people will feel heard by small increments of seeing their city aligned more and more in a trajectory with their expectations. So instead of a focus on reliable transactions, she's referring to the incremental alignment of values. So this happens through communication of priorities, the responsiveness to clearly articulated community needs, and also meeting expectations of service delivery. So taken together, this investment in institutional trustworthiness is focused more on faith than confidence, creating an identity for the institution as a values-aligned actor. So let me now move to trust by proxy. And as I mentioned during COVID, while I'm giving you some examples of institutional investment and trustworthiness, during COVID, the majority of kind of interventions that we saw were really focused on this kind of proxy relationship. So we found that the effort necessary for public institutions to invest in institutional trustworthiness is often not practical, largely because the institutions that we talked to needed to get things done yesterday, right? So the time involved in institutional trustworthiness was not in their scope of work. So in the spring of 2020, as cities found themselves in crisis response mode with COVID, racial justice protests, and other forms of political unrest, there was a growing appetite to adopt tactics that enable them to take necessary actions. So this is what I call trust by proxy. And it's the use of human or machine trusted intermediaries that enable cities to take action or deliver services in low or no trust environments. So according to Dylan Mulvin, who wrote the recent book Proxies, proxies are controllable renditions of an unpredictable world. They function as the necessary forms of make-believe and surrogacy that enable the production of knowledge. So just sit with that for a second as we talk about human proxies. Start with social media influencers, which were used quite commonly by government agencies, still are. So this is perhaps the trust by proxy in the human proxies is perhaps most clear with examples of social media influencers. So in the last 2 years, public institutions have grown their reliance on them to advance messages and connect to hard-to-reach constituencies through the relatableness and the connection to their audiences that influencers have. So for example, this is a screenshot of a post made by Loon. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's a North Carolina guy. A YouTube and Instagram content creator and podcaster, and he was hired by Guilford County, North Carolina vaccination campaign. So Loon described how he created his own concept for the piece by sticking a vaccine card on his forehead. This kind of personalization is precisely what makes this tactic effective. So what was happening here is that Guilford County wanted to act quickly to encourage vaccinations. Decision makers concluded that messaging coming directly from the Department of Public Health was not going to be sufficient. So by bringing on a series of proxies to sub for that trust relationship, the institution was able to achieve its goals more effectively. And so, I mean, just to point out, I mean, it really is the relationship here is now the constituent doesn't need to directly interface with the government. The constituent can directly influence or directly interact with the influencer who then connects to the government. So what's interesting here and why this is kind of a tech problem is that the back end was actually created by a company called Zomad. This is a tech company that facilitates the relationships between influencers and institutions. So it's mostly a brand platform. They work with a ton of brands, and only in the last 4 years or so have worked with public sector organizations. But it's a platform that organizes nano influencers and micro influencers. And for those who don't know, which I didn't, but a nano influencer is anybody with 1,000 to 10,000 followers. And a micro influencer is 10,000 to 100,000 followers. That's, I assume you're all at least micro influencers in this room. So they work with nano and micro influencers on specific campaigns and they use an algorithm to determine the reach of each influencer. So including the given audience's demographics and geography, and facilitates paying each influencer for their individual post. So this graph actually shows the success of a campaign in San Jose, California, where once they started using influencers, the number of vaccines went up pretty significantly. And the same thing happened in Guilford County. I just couldn't find the graph, unfortunately. So this works because people tend to trust those who look and act like them. So as the VP of Brand Partnerships from Zomad told me, the trend over the last decade or so has been that people of that age cohort, they trust each other. Those are the trusted messengers of that generation. They're not just going to trust the people that look like the people in City Hall. They're going to trust the people that look and sound like each other. But once we, the government, provide them the messages and the content we want them to say, we have to back off. Otherwise, it's going to be a bunch of really interesting young people sharing government press releases. So for the proxy, in this case, to sustain the trust they have with their followers, they need autonomy from the institution. The proxy does the work of government, but the trust relationship is built only between the constituent and the proxy. The institution necessarily takes a back seat. And I think what's interesting is that we see other examples of influencers on a much broader scale. So the federal government famously explored this strategy when Biden invited TikTok influencers to the White House to weigh in on the war in Ukraine, which is spoofed here in this now classic SNL skit. He also met with Olivia Rodrigo to talk about getting people vaccinated. And these mega influencers have a very different effect than the micro and nano influencers, as the power that more localized influencers have is a kind of surgical precision. So in San Jose, for example, they were looking to specifically reach Latino women in their 30s with children. And they were able to find the influencers that could reach them, and ultimately significantly boosted vaccination rates among that population. So as opposed to the sort of like these mega influencers where, again, it's like broad strokes, right? The notion of algorithmic determination of specific influencers that reach specific people allow institutions to be much more surgical in their process, right? So they're creating these proxies, but they're doing it with incredible precision. And of course that's attractive for governments who can just pay a bunch of money to Zomad to do this for them and don't have to invest in the institutional trustworthiness that would get people to actually believe them, in this case, to get vaccinated. Oh, I don't want to play this. I mean, I do want to play it, but I don't think we have time, so. Okay, sorry. All right. So now we want to talk about machine proxies real quick. And how am I doing on time? Like, oh, good. Yeah, I'll be done. Okay, so machine proxies function in a similar way to human proxies, only the agent with which the constituent interacts is a machine. So, so let's talk about blockchain, for example. Everybody loves talking about blockchain. Like, I don't want to be that guy at the party that tries to explain blockchain to somebody, but you know, it's a decentralized ledger technology. You all know what that means? And I won't go into it, but it's mostly used in the context of transactions of digital assets. We know it mostly from cryptocurrencies, right? But you know, ultimately, its function is that through all I'll say about it technically is that its function through smart contracts essentially is that you can automate the transaction. Once you create the smart contract and run it, then at that point no human can intervene, right? It's essentially a machine that can automate its transactions outside of a human needing to legitimize the transaction. That's a very basic way of describing its function and the way in which people are dreaming of its uses. And of course, this has changed after FTX a bit. But let's talk about city uses. So some cities, and this is not as uncommon as you think, but Reno, Nevada is one of the more famous examples now, are exploring ways of incorporating blockchain technologies for record keeping and transactions as a means of bypassing institutional interaction. So the mayor of Reno loves to talk about, for a while there, she was calling herself the blockchain mayor, and she was actually, her whole identity was in a way her whole identity was this notion that government can be autonomous, essentially, and government didn't need the human intermediaries in order to function. That's changed a little bit since the bottom has fallen out recently, but we can talk about that in later if we want. But similarly, I just want this very simple graphic. Similarly, we still see this kind of proxy relationship as people are moving into those proxies and in some cases trusting the machine intermediary so they don't have to trust the institution. So a central theme in the existing literature on public sector uses of blockchain is its ability to increase or facilitate trust in government processes through the immutability of records and the redundant data verification process. So as such, the technology is often represented as trustless because it bypasses the need for human actors to trust a mediating entity. So Teddy, who's a blockchain developer in Nevada, explained this to me. The whole point of this is that it's supposed to be a trustless system where you don't need to trust anybody to follow through with their side of the deal, because it's automatically going to be executed by a smart contract. You don't need to trust anybody. So a lot of this is like blockchain bro discourse, so there's like a whole lot of kind of enthusiasm around blockchain in the development community, but in the kind of public sector context, these ideas were resonating, right? These ideas are resonating. If only we can create a system where we actually don't need to have trust because we can automate these things. That's a dream. And we don't need to invest in these other kinds of facilitation processes. So blockchain technologies are being used to create the idea of an immediately responsive, trustless system that creates confidence in transactions. So this is a great example is Quark ID, a project started by the city of Buenos Aires in collaboration with blockchain startups and nonprofits with the idea of creating a digital identity system. So digital ID is a big deal. In fact, Europe has Europe has just voted in the digital ID process. So we're about to hear a whole lot more about digital identification, whether or not they're facilitated on chain. But this system could, in the government's eyes, materialize the vision of an interconnected government that at the same time offers guarantees that privacy and autonomy are prioritized. And so what's interesting about what was happening in Argentina is that this actually wasn't implemented. It was a white paper called White Paper Tango that was released. That was basically a position statement that mobilized all of these actors to want to operate in this way. And in Argentina, if we think back to that Edelman graph that I showed you, Argentina has the least amount of trust in its government of any of the democracies that were surveyed. So in the case of Argentina, the dream of a blockchain government is a significant one, right? The idea that we can build these proxies that would actually enable these transactions without humans is a way out, essentially, to what many people see as a failed state. So this is in line with one of the smart city lead. One of the smart city leads in Buenos Aires told us. He said, "I truly believe that the city can be infinitely more intelligent and efficient if we understand that citizens rarely engage with the city government, much less than one thinks. By employing data and technology, it is possible to create a much more efficient, a much faster experience, and without the need for bureaucracy, paperwork, and long processes. The government needs to understand that it is a means for whatever the person wants to do." And so in this case, this gets at this notion of it's just a means. It should fall into the background. It's invisible, right? So why invest in institutional trustworthiness if really what we want to do is we just want to create a vehicle that enables these transactions? And if only we could do that without investing in trustworthiness, then we're golden. And so then there are extreme examples, like this one in El Salvador, Bitcoin City. I was going to show you a little video here, but I don't think I'm going to for interest of time. But this is a remarkable example of the president of El Salvador is like, he's talk about one of those blockchain bros. He's super enthusiastic about blockchain. Has created this concept of Bitcoin City. Wants this to be truly a city that's created from the ground up that would be entirely facilitated through crypto. And so Bitcoin is going to save the world, and it starts here in El Salvador. This is the evolution of humankind. You can't stop evolution. So it's a great video if you want to take some time to watch it. It's going to play. Wait, I didn't mean to do that. Actually, I'll play a few seconds. Oh, you can't hear it. Never mind. All right, sorry. Okay. All right, I want to just introduce a few other contexts, and then I'm going to conclude. So another technology is smart assistants, another proxy technology. So we see examples of this all over the world. Shown here is, this is Bati from Buenos Aires, and this is MyGov from India, so two examples of WhatsApp-enabled bots. And these are digital representatives of the city. It can handle a range of requests from where to get vaccinated to how to pay parking tickets. And the left image is the avatar the government uses in all of its promotion of Bati. And next to it, we see Bati telling one of my colleagues and the co-author of our report that he has COVID. So Bati is like this all-service kind of digital concierge for a number of cities. So in our interviews with the team behind Bati, we saw that they had a vision of government as being both efficient and relatable. And so Bati's team devotes significant resources to the development of Bati's personality, making sure that they have that perfect balance of cleverness and utility. So the chief data officer of Buenos Aires refers to Bati as both the city and a citizen, meaning that it is an affable representative of the government that makes people feel good about their interactions. Once they were able to refine the personality of the bot, people stopped talking to the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Security, and they just started talking with Bati. So again, you see the kind of discursive dream here of Bati standing in for these human intermediaries. So the relatableness of the chatbot is very important. So part of being an effective proxy is creating effective connection with the trustee. So Bati's designer shared with us that how they put personality foremost in its design. So I'll just read this quickly. A conversation is the way that humans create empathy with other humans, and conversations through chatbots allow for this possibility, which of course has to do with values and what the user imagines on the other side. In fact, in 2018, when we launched Bati, no platform accepted emojis as part of the dialogue, since it was assumed that bots spoke by entering a certain word or group of words. But if you have a good semantic interpreter, the right solutions will come, and incorporating emojis allowed us to put Bati's personality into practice. So what's interesting here is that from the case of blockchain that was meant to really move away from any kind of human traits. What we see with smart assistants is an incorporation of human traits into this proxy relationship. So just this is actually from North Carolina. This is MyGov. Oh wait, no, this is the one from India. Yeah, this is the one from India, never mind. This is the one from North Carolina. So, and this one is interesting because, there are like, oh shoot, this blocks it up. There's one from Virginia on the bottom, but the one in North Carolina has increased voter turnout and driver's license registration by significant numbers, right? So they're actually, governments are looking at these smart assistants and actually seeing some results. Okay. So chatbots are being used as proxies to government by building trust and or confidence. In some cases like Bhati, we see an emphasis on creating intimacy through interaction with an almost human agent. And in other cases, like the North Carolina DMV, the emphasis is on efficient transactions with a machine agent. So looking to the future, we have to understand that generative AI will provide better means of building trust and or confidence in a range of institutional settings, from legal proceedings, which this is already happening, to policy making, to everyday bureaucratic interactions. And I'm sure none of us can avoid the sort of fear and enthusiasm around ChatGPT and now GPT-4, what the implications of this are for the future of governance and the future of democracy are significant, because these are already, this kind of generative AI is already being built into these smart assistants, right? So we have, there's a sort of a new layer. This is all so new that I don't have any really good AI examples of these smart assistants yet, but governments are implementing them right now. So what's to be done? Institutions are blunt instruments, and technologists and practitioners are eager to develop and deploy more precision tools to facilitate public life. But at what cost? So if attention is not paid to what is meant by trust, the ultimate function of public institutions and the consequence of short-term functionality, then I'm afraid cities can be doing more damage than good, as we know. So I just want to end with a couple of design considerations. So this is in our report. We conclude with some of these recommendations for practitioners and policymakers, and I just want to share a couple of them with you. So the first one that I'll share is this connecting interventions to diagnoses. So too often, smart governance interventions are imagined and executed without intentionally making the connection to what motivated them in the first place. So is distrust a matter of unreliable transactions or a misalignment of values, or both? Public sector organizations need to understand the nature of the problem they're trying to solve before trying to solve it. And earlier, we were talking about the lack of ability for practitioners to actually reflect on what it is that they're doing. And this, I'm afraid, is what I'm seeing, is that there's a rush to implementation with so much of this, and there's a disconnect between the problem that people are trying to solve and the solutions that they're executing. So the second thing I want to leave you with is that proxies can be an effective way to address institutional distrust and get things done by including third parties in a trust relationship. As we mentioned, we see upticks in voter turnout, we see upticks in vaccination rates, like all the things, right? So they're working along those metrics, which is creating a not surprising enthusiasm among government practitioners. But it is unclear what impact they have on long-term trustworthiness of the institution. So they might even exacerbate the problem. Institutional leaders should also assess the risks and implications of authorizing non-government voices as official ones. Non-human proxies like distributed trust blockchains should also be assessed critically, and overall these strategies should be approached with some critical distance, of course. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. Empathy and relatability can be virtues for government institutions and their proxies. Creating bots that feel almost human can cultivate trust among constituents. It can also generate skepticism if it becomes too human or inauthentically mechanical. So what level of relatability is too relatable? As cities invest in digital concierge or human proxies, there is a need to understand what kind of relationship is optimal to achieve sustainable benefit for the institution. And I'll leave you with this. Smart urban governance is not smart if it is only looking to build trust in the short term. We need to build a smart urban governance agenda that centers the ethical and democratic implications of tech-enhanced decision-making on our public institutions. This does not mean guardrails for AI. It does not only mean guardrails for AI, et cetera, which of course is happening, but it also means centering systems of trust in innovation rhetoric. And with that, thank you very much for listening.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
My name is Nicole, and I wanted to question you a little bit more about like human proxies and like influencers. You mentioned like throughout your presentation like the importance of authenticity, correct? Yeah. And so I think one of the reasons that like influencers are so effective is because they like have some sort of authenticity to them, right?
Yep.
But a lot of the times, like you used Olivia Rodrigo and like President Biden as an example of like a proxy. But like to me, I feel as if that's like an inauthentic interaction. Like, what does Joe Biden know about Olivia Rodrigo, right? He's like almost 80. Like, yeah. I don't know. It just seems inauthentic, right? So, and I feel like when governments like use these human proxies to I don't know, like fuel trust in themselves, like it makes the proxy like inauthentic. And so another example is like at the start of COVID, you had like all these celebrities singing like the Imagine song. Do you remember that?
Yep.
And it's like that was like so inauthentic because it's like these were like millionaire actresses and actors like singing in their like mansions about COVID, right? So it's like, where do you find the line between like actually creating like an authentic interaction versus like it's like an obvious, oh, this is what the government is trying to get us to do?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And
Sorry, that was very long.
No, it was a good question. And it's I wasn't clear enough, I think, in making that distinction. What I meant to communicate in showing the examples of the TikTokers in Ukraine and Olivia Rodrigo was that level of influencer actually isn't effective. And so what it's like governments are trying to do it, but the effectiveness is coming from these nano and micro influencers, right? So this is companies like Zomad, and there are others as well, these kind of influencer marketing firms. They're only working with nano and micro influencers. And in fact, mostly nano influencers is people who are hyper local, who have 2,000 followers but are super active. Those are the ones that are going to that have that kind of authentic voice. So, and what happens with these campaigns is that you have dozens or more of these influencers with any locality that are doing this within their kind of influence. In their sphere of influence, and that's where you get the impact. So this is why like San Jose was able to say we want to reach Latino women in their 30s with children, right? Like you can do that because we have the social media data to know who each of these influencers is reaching, and then they can do these posts. And by the way, these posts are all they have to disclose that it's a sponsored post. You probably know, right? So like. So even if it's coming from the government, they're like, yep, this is from San Jose City, and then they put their own spin on it, but it still has this kind of authentic feel to it, right? It's not the city speaking to you, but it's the influencer. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, as a follow-up, like, what do you think? I guess that works like it's effective to like use small community stuff, but then I guess it doesn't work as well on like the large scale, like the national government, for instance. So like, could you like maybe what are like your opinions on like making like a proxy for like a national proxy more relatable? So that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I'll just say, and I want to get to a couple other questions, but I would just say that the whole thing terrifies me. So it's hard to say like what I would like how I want to see it play out. I know with the people at Zomad, for example, they are right now solidifying contracts with the federal government to do nano and micro influencer campaigns. So it is happening, and I think we'll see more of it play out. As I said, I mean, if government's a blunt instrument, the more precise you can be with different kinds of technological tools to reach people, that's a very attractive proposition. So of course there's going to be investment and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I have the mic. Sorry, didn't raise my hand, but earlier. So the question that I had, the presentation was fantastic. Thank you very much for both being here and for, speaking about these things. And as you were speaking, I had this thought in my mind about the word trust, right? And even in the conversation that was just happening, it's sort of what it sounds as though these institutions are hoping for is a trust in almost a compliance with the institutional agenda that has been laid out. And so I was wondering if instead of trust, the word agency or participation could be employed and how that would change the dynamic. I was specifically thinking, of course, of models of the public sphere and ideas of the refeudalization of the public sphere that Habermas talks about, as well as Nekton Kluge later on, and sort of evaluating how new technologies, for them, 1980s, 1990s technologies, would then change participation in the public sphere and the sort of constitution of the institution rather than the compliance with the institution. And so, especially in discussing the AI platforms, I've used the DMV's platform that enables you to move through that institutional infrastructure in an efficient manner. And so its reach is fantastic in that manner, but it doesn't enable then participation and kind of collaboration in the constitution of the institution. And so how the study would change if participation and agency were to be sort of centered rather than a trust. You were just talking about blunt instruments, and it sort of reinforced the question for me.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I would say how to answer that question. I suppose the questions that we were asking when we started this research is how government practitioners were thinking about the problem, right? And to your point, they're not so much thinking about agency, they're thinking about how the hell do we govern, at a time when no one trusts us. And so what became really clear here is that there is this distinction between, in the modalities of institutional trustworthiness, there is much more of that consideration to agency, right? When institutions are actually thinking about co-designing services, co-designing outcomes, like that, of course, does consider and center the agency of the people who are most impacted by those services. But when we get into these proxy relationships, you're absolutely right. Like that's gone, right? And I think part of what I'm teasing out here is that the proxy becomes a lot easier because the technology enables the proxy to exist. And in a time of crisis, and as we're sort of coming out of a time of crisis, and all of this was happening over the last couple of years, in a time of crisis, the go-to was, we need the quick solution. We have things to get done and can't do it because no one trusts us, right? So like that's the central problem. So it's like getting to that level of critical, of thinking about agency in the proxy relationship, I hope is something that can happen, because I don't see the proxy concept going away. I actually only see it getting more robust. And I think this is and I think that there's a lot of really important work to be done to help shape that. And but I think it's a great point, and I take it, and I think that I think it's worth being more explicit about that, because you're right. Yeah, thank you.
So I think of this whole use of proxies thing as becoming something we're all more aware of thanks to the pandemic. Yeah. And we all interacted with these in some way. And as the point was mentioned earlier, I think of the Imagine thing that also came to mind when we were talking about this. And one of the short-term effects of using these proxies was this perception of performativity from the government that people were concerned about.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if now that we're a couple years into using this sort of thing, if we're starting to see what those long-term effects are. I know that you kind of concluded with it's important to consider the long term. I'm wondering if we're seeing what that looks like yet.
I don't think we are. I actually don't. I think that this is, because we haven't emerged out of the kind of celebratory rhetoric. I mean, as evidenced by things like Bitcoin City or, these other kinds of just kind of imaginaries, these sort of nutty imaginaries of where this can go. I don't think we're not out of that yet. So, and I don't think that this is also new, that the long-term implications have not been thought about or realized effectively. I mean, we're seeing this right now. Like, we know that within the AI context, I mean, there's a lot of work happening right now about governing AI, right? How do we govern this thing? And how do we govern this thing as it gets implemented in an institutional context? And so I think that we have similar questions around, we can expand that AI conversation to proxies in general. How do we govern that? Because if we don't effectively govern the sort of impulse to create proxies in our public institutions, then it has sort of dire long-term consequences, right? So that's how I see what's possible now is figuring out how to govern it, having that conversation with practitioners who are not trying to destroy the world, right? Like, they're actually trying to get their jobs done. And so, like, how do you have those conversations with people who need to get something done and are seeing these technologies as opportunities to get those things done, and often are bringing these really, I mean, again, at least in, I would say in most large cities, progressive values to this, right? And so we have this really interesting desire to create these systems that are guided by progressive values, and yet what's happening in practice sometimes are these sort of like stopgap measures that are sort of using technology to plug holes in the dam. So I think it's a good question. This is what's motivating my whole research agenda at the moment, is to try to answer, like, what are these long-term consequences.
Hi, good afternoon. So I think about engagement, right? So I work in marketing and sales, and so engagement is really important, and understanding how people engage with content is really important to me. But I also think about if a heavy-handed opposite to engagement is alienation, and we talk about progressive values and how our governments are connecting with people. I'd like to know your thoughts, or like to hear your thoughts or observations on that percent of the population that we know doesn't want to be engaged, right? Who are going to feel alienated by proxies or even by the processes themselves with no proxy. What are your thoughts on those folks, and how do you get them engaged?
Well, I mean, this is the question that certainly city governments are asking themselves, which is, and again, was made more clear during COVID. When the consequences of non-engagement were life and death, right? Like, that was the sort of context of COVID. And so how do you engage those groups of people? And I want to say this about engagement. One of the challenges with engagement, I run a lab called the Engagement Lab, and I think engagement is a sort of overused term. It kind of like doesn't mean anything anymore. But I think one of the things about engagement that's interesting is that so often when institutions want to engage, what they really mean is, and I think this goes to your question actually, what they really mean is, how do we get them to know about what we're doing, right? Like, how do we do that? And that's how they often think about the problem of engagement, is just communicating what it is that they're doing, as opposed to creating kind of foundational, collaborative contexts for long-term governance or whatever the case may be. So I think that the problem of, like, engagement is such a problematic term at this point. And I think if we say what we really mean by engagement is that we need, if the goal of public serving institutions is to, let's just say for the moment, we can't get into this now, but let's say the goal of public serving institutions is to be responsive to the constituents who are governed, right? Let's just say that. And so that is the goal of public serving institutions. And often the way that is framed is we have everything in place, we just need to get them on board. And so that's a lot of the proxy relationship is like, we got our proxies, let's get them into our systems. The institutional trustworthiness, though, is a different kind of engagement. That's about relationship building. I mean, that goes back to the sort of my previous framework of meaningful inefficiencies. It creates a context for kind of social infrastructure for relations that can build the trust relationship that would enable long-term effectiveness of that institution. And brands are realizing this too, right? Brands realize that there's a trust relationship with brands too, and it's not just transactional. And there's a communication of values that are really important even as we consume brands. And so public sector institutions are thinking the same way now, but how do we communicate those values such that the consumer of whatever those services aren't just taking that in, but feel a sense of ownership in that service. Mm-hmm. And that's how I see the problem of engagement right now is to, and I think that the sort of move towards proxies is hurting that effort. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, we are almost running out of time, so I'm just going to get 2 more questions here, and then.
Hi, just wanted to thank you again for your lovely presentation. I do have a quick question regarding the sort of ways that we trust AI and the sort of like coded biases that go into the algorithms that create these automated responses and whatnot. And I guess in more of a general sense, like what are your thoughts on coded like algorithmic biases? Because there's always going to be those governing people behind these systems, of course, dictating and creating and curating this information that goes out to people. So how even though it might be easier to navigate that certain system of getting answers online, how can we still be sure that we're getting this accurate information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question there that I want to, the string that I want to pull there is that, whether we're trusting AI systems or whether we're trusting blockchain systems, it actually, there are a whole lot of humans behind all of those systems, right? And so we are, in fact, trusting the design of those systems. And this is why the question around, biases in AI and sort of racist AI bots and like that, all of that is super important because we're actually sort of pulling out the human agents that are ultimately responsible for this, or what's happening now with the right-wing response to sort of woke AI, right? I don't know if you've been following that, but the interesting thing about like ChatGPT as it was released, it was it has pretty progressive politics. Like the kind of scaffolding around it was to like, for example, I asked it 2 questions. Why are there more men in prison in the United States than women? And it said, well, this is like these are the numbers. This is the reality. There are more men in prison. And I asked, well, why are there more black people in prison than in the United States than white people? And it said, well, there are structural inequities that lead to. And so it went on this like incredibly informed response to the question of incarceration. And this is what's creating a reaction among a right-wing reaction to it, right? Which is like these AI agents are actually being curated with a particular set of values, and then there's effort right now to create alternative AI agents that have a different set of values, right? So we are like, our trust in any of these systems are curated by the human values that are going to go into designing them. So while the individual transaction, we may feel like there's a kind of proxy from here to there, there's actually all sorts of people and mechanisms that go into that proxy trust relationship. So I mean, it's a super interesting question, and the same is true with blockchain. I mean, blockchain, like smart contracts are coded by people, right? So and then we know with Bitcoin, like everything is mined by people, right? So there's all sorts of humans involved. And to think about that that's a way of, I think, complicating the sort of simplistic proxy relationship that we're finding ourselves in. Yeah.
Hi there. It's
Hi.
almost not a question,
okay.
But I'm Fredessa Hamilton, graduated from CRDM in 2013, but I got here in 2006, so that tells you how long it took me. Anyway, one of the concerns that I always have is the urban versus rural divide. I'm particularly concerned right now, especially in North Carolina, because my background is telecom, and now we're talking about rural broadband and so on and so forth. I guess I'm making a statement more than a question, but I am very concerned that we don't take urban solutions and package them back up and make them rural solutions, because we're still missing so much of what we expect is out there to be able to be used. Broadband and wireless is probably the biggest issue that we have right now. But in addition to that, even if we're talking about the phone that is wired into your house, it really does not help us get the high-speed broadband kind of solutions that we want, and could potentially be exploited or distorted by bad actors. So some of what I'm concerned about is that when we get ready to redesign for the rural communities, the counties and stuff like that, that we look at the differences that are going on in that side of our country as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll leave that non-question with a non-response. I think that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And I just wanted to thank Eric again for...
Thank you.
And so thank you all for coming. We're going to adjourn now for lunch.